Hello everyone. On behalf of ANROWS, I would like to welcome you to today's webinar, Strengthening Accountability Across Perpetrator Intervention Systems. My name is Michelle Robinson and I'm the Director of Evidence to Action at ANROWS. I acknowledge the traditional owners of the land across Australia on which we meet today, and on behalf of ANROWS, pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Wherever we are today, we are on unceded Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander land, and I acknowledge and pay respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people participating in the webinar today. The research report. Today's webinar is a panel discussion which will be followed by a live Q&A. So please send through your questions at any time during the course of the discussion and we'll try to get to as many as we can. The research report and resources related to the research project are available in the handout section of GoToWebinar. It will be recorded and available on our website as soon as possible. You can also subscribe to the ANROWS notepad to be notified as to its availability. Finally, we have a survey that will come up as you exit the webinar. If you could take a couple of minutes to complete it, we'd really appreciate your feedback, and your responses will help us to improve the program moving forward. So today's webinar is going to discuss the project Improved Accountability, the role of perpetrator intervention systems. The project comprises 10 research studies that examine Australian perpetrator intervention systems, and some of the findings will be discussed today. There was an extensive expert research team, and the names of all of those who participated in the research are listed on the screen. The project was part of the Perpetrator Interventions research stream at ANROWS, which provides an evidence base for the improvement of both systems and services and responses to the diversity of men who use violence. Just as a note about language as we proceed, during the webinar, we will be using the term perpetrator and perpetrators of violence to refer to men causing domestic and family violence harm. This term is also based on the parameters of the research and the service system that was examined in the course of the research. Turning to the panel, who are all on the screen with us today, and I'd just like to take a short moment to say thank you very much to all of you, and in particular for the conditions under which you've all participated today. We're having some internet connectivity problems both in Western Australia and in Victoria. So let's hope that we all get to stay on at least audio. So I'd like to introduce Professor Donna Chung from Curtin University, Dr. Karen Upton-Davis, also from Curtin University, Elena Campbell from RMIT in Victoria, and Rodney Vlay from Victoria. Welcome everybody. Before we proceed, I'd just like to note that this is a confronting topic and some participants may find it distressing. It's critical that you take care of yourself while watching this webinar. If you would like to access support, you can contact any of the services listed on the screen, including 1800-RESPECT, Men's Referral Service and Lifeline. Okay, Donna. Turning to you, and Donna's coming to us from Albany in Western Australia, and Donna's connectivity was so poor that she has had to move to a cafe. So Donna, we thank you very much for taking the time and your generous spirit in which you're participating today. Donna, let's unpack perpetrator accountability. Holding perpetrators accountable is stated as a key aim in many domestic and family violence policies and programs. What does this actually mean? Could you provide a brief outline of the research and tell us what it revealed about the term accountability and what implications this might have for policy and practice?
Thanks, Michelle. If I just go to the next slide, Rachel, that'd be great. Thanks. So the project was a kind of monster-sized project, which I think took it out of us all. But essentially what we tried to do was to really focus on perpetrator intervention systems across their breadth and width in Australia at present. So it involved a some work examining existing research, for example, a meta-study of protection orders and under what conditions do protection orders work best, through to examinations of accountability, and then how accountability worked in everyday life, if you like, or when the rubber hits the road, around local services, local networks of coordinated responses as well, and some specialist services. So we really tried to understand, like, how do we move this forward, but also how's it currently being used or not quite used so well at the moment. When we reviewed all of the policy literature as well as the academic literature, what really stood out and shocked us really was that there was really no clear definitions of a perpetrator accountability much in any of the literature. So it's a kind of quite a complex idea, but it's kind of thrown around without much definition. So for us, often what we saw was perpetrator responsibility and accountability as being treated exactly the same, rather than seeing it as two different things. So for us, there's a real clear distinction between perpetrator responsibility as being something which is internal and in a sense individualized. So it is about how individual perpetrators and possibly their support systems think and individualize and feel responsible for what's happened. Whereas perpetrator accountability very broadly for us was much more of an external mechanism over and above the level of the individual, so that it wasn't about individualizing the problem, and that in order to address domestic violence we solely need to have you take responsibility. So it was much more about external mechanisms, and that they were often at present primarily administered by the state through law, through legislation, and following on how courts interpreted legislation and carried those actions out. So a lot of accountability was focused very much, or was reduced to primarily being about legislative responses and then the court actions. I guess the other thing that really struck us with this work is that in order to have perpetrator accountability, we actually need agencies to be working in a way that's very domestic and family violence informed, but also they need to be accountable around how they're working with perpetrators, how they are or aren't sharing information, how they're making referrals, following up, working together. So it's such a highly interdependent set of systems that in fact accountability of agencies to each other was as critical as it was in terms of how practitioners on the ground are able to do their work, which was deeply affected by whether or not other agencies were doing work that was DVFV focused. Okay, next slide, please. Oops, hang on. I think, yep, that's it. Great. Hang on, I think we've gone the wrong way around with the slides. Oh, well, never mind. So for us, I guess, in terms of thinking about domestic and family violence policy, program and practice, particularly interventions for perpetrators, perpetrator accountability was most often described as the secondary goal of intervention with perpetrators. So it was always to hold perpetrators accountable for their use of violence and the impacts which it has on others. And I guess for us, that was the difference between that and responsibility, that it's a much broader concept about being externally held accountable, both for your past actions, but also being held accountable about how you will be safer into the future. And I think for us, that's the shift that isn't always happening, and particularly because often courts are working about retrospectively around incidents of what's happening rather than around some form of accountability for future actions and for future safety as well. So it's rarely defined, and there's little consensus on its meaning, which I know doesn't come up with the absolute kind of defining moment for this work, but I think what it does is that it really raises important debate about that needs to be had about what perpetrator accountability looks like, but also importantly for us, what is the accountability more broadly within the systems of agencies to respond in ways that hold perpetrators accountable too. So I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
Thank you, Donna. And because it was such a broad-reaching research project, would anybody else on the project team like to comment on that concept of accountability?
Yes, I think one of the things that we were really struck with, as you described it, Donna, that difference between accountability as mechanisms, as things that justice systems or other systems do to perpetrators, for understandable, reasons to manage risk, etc. But often accountability is seen just as those actions, and that accountability is done or ticked off when the protection order is administered or when the perpetrator has been charged or convicted. Whereas it's really different from accountability as a process which centralises the harm that is caused to adult and child victim survivors and to family functioning. It's a very different starting point to look at perpetrator accountability. And it's a harder starting point because it relies upon people thinking about what has this man's specific actions been that has harmed family functioning, that's had impacts on adult and child victim survivors. What is the harm that his curse of control and social entrapment has caused? And so therefore, what does he need to start doing and to stop doing over a period of time to stop that harm and to make up for some of those effects? And that's accountability to harm caused and accountability for actions in relation to harm caused. It's a very different way of looking at accountability, where it becomes a process for him to understand that harm and to work towards trying to repair some of that caused. And for service systems that are often focusing on crisis management, triaging, managing risk, being able to take that perpetrator pattern-based approach to document, map patterns over time, and to keep visibility with him to enable those processes of accountability to be scaffolded, we realise it's a major challenge that our research has highlighted.
And I would just add, absolutely agree with Rodney, and I would just add in terms of the accountability of the system, sometimes we mistake system activity for system effectiveness. So we're all very, very busy. We've got a churn of family violence matters coming through our services and through our courts. And sometimes the default is to slip into the idea that the activity or the referral that we've made or the order that we've imposed equates to accountability, that's all we have to do, and then our own accountability is absolved. But what we actually need to do is make sure that that particular step taken in that particular area is linked to another step, which in turn increases her safety and reduces his risk. And that's the bit we haven't mastered yet. That's the bit we have to actually achieve if we're going to get to the point of having a genuine perpetrator intervention system.
Thanks, Alana. I think that's a great segue into the next component, major component of the research project, the perpetrator intervention system. Karen, as we've just heard, the various parts of the justice system, together with the service system, the men's behaviour change programs, for example, have been understood as key pathways for perpetrators and therefore as critical points for perpetrator interventions, both from a personal and a systemic accountability perspective. Karen, could you expand on the concept of perpetrator intervention systems? And we're particularly interested in the plural of this, but and also as part of that, I guess, understanding how the information sharing component, what that looks like.
Yes, Michelle, thank you. Yes, so perpetrator intervention systems specifically refer to those systems responses that focus on perpetrators and on perpetration. And in conceptualising perpetrator intervention systems, we aim to shine a light specifically on responses to perpetrators so that relevant policies and astute responses can be developed, and so that perpetrators can be more visible within the systems. So perpetrator intervention systems are a part of, not separate to, integrated domestic and family violence service system, whose primary role is to work towards victim safety, perpetrator accountability, and the promotion of effective domestic and family violence responses in the community and within the systems. The integrated domestic and family violence service system comprises what we have conceptualised as Tier 1 services. those services that provide a specialised domestic and family violence response, or partly specialise in this response. So that includes services such as men's behaviour change programs, of course, but also parts of the police, corrective services, courts, child protection, etc. So we think it's important to broaden the vision of who's included within perpetrator intervention systems, as each and every service can play a valuable part in keeping perpetrators in view and corralling them towards some change. And this is why we've included in the perpetrator intervention system what we've conceptualised as Tier 2 and Tier 3 services. So we've categorised services into Tiers 2 and 3 according to the extent to which they share information and offer a coordinated response with Tier 1 services. Tier 2 services comprise services such as drug and alcohol responses, mental health services, hospitals, homelessness services, primary healthcare services, schools, etc. Family law services as well. So these services don't generally offer a specialised domestic and family violence response themselves, but nevertheless they encounter many perpetrators and victims, and they sometimes share information with Tier 1 services. So there's much scope for Tier 2 services to make valuable contributions to perpetrator intervention systems. Tier 3 services, for example, aged care and refugee settlement services, workplaces, are yet to be brought into an integrated domestic and family violence service system response. But we do see that there's a role for them as we go on. So if we include in our planning and deliberations the services that comprise all 3 tiers, we can move towards a joined up, integrated and coordinated response across the entire landscape, a unified system rather than the multiple systems that now operate. Those multiple systems can be seen on the maps that were developed as part of this research project, and I understand that Rachel is kindly sharing the link to those maps with you now. They're web-based. So the maps show the perpetrator intervention systems across every state and territory of Australia. They show the pathways between the systems, and they show the volume and visibility of perpetrators on those pathways. We see the maps as a starting point from which later comparisons can be made as information becomes more readily available and as systems join up. So systems will become joined up when everyone becomes involved in identifying perpetration, in systematically recording perpetrator information, in sharing that information with appropriate others, and in taking action on perpetration, even if that action is only to contribute a piece of information that makes clearer the extent and the use of the perpetrator's violence. So even though we call for broader input into perpetrator intervention systems, we understand that not all services should or could make the same level of contribution. The level of contribution will very much depend on the level of expertise in relation to domestic and family violence. Contributions need to be carefully considered along with the risks inherent in every intervention. So for a fleshed out consideration of appropriate service participation in perpetrator intervention systems, I steer you to Chapter 3 of the report, specifically to the section entitled The Detection and Action Wheel, which brings me to information sharing. It's important to keep in mind that of the total number of perpetrators of domestic violence out in the community, only a very small percentage arrive at the formal system of response from formal system of domestic and family violence response, mostly via a law and order response. but virtually all perpetrators interact with the service system for reasons other than their domestic and family violence perpetration. That's why we need to harness all services, no matter their primary role, to help us to keep eyes on the perpetrator and to move them towards some positive change. The invisibility of perpetrators across the systems can only be made visible through information sharing. That's all I want to say for the time being. Thank you.
Very much, Karen. And just to mention that Karen's also based in Western Australia today. Would any of the other panel members like to comment on the perpetrator intervention system and the mapping process as outlined by Karen?
Just very briefly, I think what it did is it really highlighted to us and to practitioners, it kind of will vindicate their understandings that there's so many disconnects across perpetrator intervention systems, and they don't even necessarily see themselves as part of an intervention system. So I think that's a really important part of it, and also that often we only see that kind of joined up approach where agencies are held accountable around perpetrator work in the most tragic of circumstances. So often we only engage in those processes with coroner's inquiries, serious case reviews, etc., royal commissions. So to actually put that on the front foot and be the way we design services, not respond to individual avoidable tragedies, I think is a really important part of the work.
I think also just, oh, sorry, Elena, please.
No, you go, you go.
Are you sure?
Yep.
I think just really briefly, the information sharing part of that is a real challenge, I think, for service systems really across Australia, because we're starting to try to work out what does it mean to share information regarding risk, including information that we obtain from perpetrators, and in what circumstances can we share information with other agencies to assist a coordinated, community response. When we're thinking about accountability, we're thinking about, well, how do we share information regarding his patterns of harm that he's caused? And yes, part of that's about risk, but it's not only about risk. Various different agencies may find out important information about the harm that is caused, the impacts, and therefore what he needs to be held accountable to. But how do we pull that information together over time when it's held in little bits across different agencies if there's not a current immediate risk situation that requires us to share information? I think it's one of the real challenges in translating this. Sorry, Elena.
No, that's right. Complimentary as ever, Rodney. I was just going to add that as Karen has identified, obviously different services will have different levels of involvement and responsibility. And one of the challenges in this area, as we're experiencing in Victoria, is working out what support services need to be able to do the work that is required in responding to people who use family violence, who come through their doors, but when they don't necessarily come through their doors for that reason. And there's often a tension between the objectives of, say, an AOD intervention, which is about developing a real rapport, and in the context of a therapeutic relationship with a practitioner, where you need to keep that engagement with that fella because you want him to address his AOD issues, but you're also aware that there's a broader context happening. How do you respond to that? What do you do more widely as a practitioner without displacing the therapeutic relationship that you want to develop, and also without contributing to any narrative in this context that AOD is the cause of all of this harm that he might be inflicting on his family members. So it's a really, really tricky exercise, and what that means is that government and policy makers have to be accountable for the fact that that is a big foundational piece of work that has to sit under perpetrator intervention systems, and it has to be resourced as such.
And it's also really complementary to the work that we've just done today. We've released a synthesis piece on integrated service provision, predominantly looking at responses to survivor victims of domestic violence, but equally so, this is the other part of that, the mirror image, so to speak. Turning to you now, Elena, one of the research included 3 case studies on how perpetrator intervention systems are working in particular regions, and one of these was the Southern Metro region of Victoria. Are you able to give us an overview of this study and what were the findings and implications? And I'd also like to acknowledge that you are also working from home under fairly difficult circumstances today, and thank you for your generous time, and to your son for giving up his room.
No problem. So thanks. Yes, this case study was a bit of a labour of love for me, which was developed over a couple of years in collaboration with the Integrated Family Violence Partnerships, who sit in the Southern Melbourne and the Bayside Peninsula area, which make up the Southern Metro Police region. And it's a region of Victoria which experiences one of the most consistently high call-out rates for family violence incidents, and it's also a region of Victoria that has a particular concentration of men's behaviour change programs and some really great innovative developments in terms of responses to family violence. So it was something that we wanted to examine because we wanted to look at what does an emerging or evolving perpetrator intervention system look like, while at the same time the practitioners who participated in the study, and there were over 150 who did so at a time of incredible pressure and reform overload, so I'm really grateful for their involvement. They really wanted to test it out. They wanted to tease it out and get together and say, what are the gaps, what are the challenges that we're trying to address or that we need to know about, and what are we doing well. So there were certainly some opportunities or some challenges that we found, but there were actually examples of really promising practice which indicate that it's already occurring and evolving in terms of a perpetrator system. And I want to highlight that because sometimes in the context of our more exhausted moments, we might feel that that's not the case. But the first thing I suppose I wanted to highlight as a finding was a real divergence between the objectives of men's behaviour change programs, MBCPs, and many other elements of the perpetrator intervention system that was developing. This included perhaps sometimes a lack of understanding about what MBCPs are designed to do or how they do it, which meant that some services then avoided interacting with MBCPs or made assumptions that a referral there wouldn't be helpful for their client. And sometimes it manifested sort of as an impatience from some sectors who had assumptions about what that work might be. At the same time, somewhat conversely, it also resulted in a sort of tendency to place the burden for fixing perpetrators of family violence onto MBCPs in a very kind of unrealistic frame. Oh, well, what are they doing? You know, if we refer, we've done our bit, as I was talking about before, we've done our bit, we've referred him, and now it's their job to fix him and to make him accountable. And a real kind of lack of opportunity for people to actually come together and discuss each other's shared objectives. This is what we try and do and why. Oh, okay, that's not quite what we're trying to do, but how can we bring those objectives together so we're all working towards the same goal? So that goes back to the theme that we're looking at in chapter 1 of the research, in that tension between, are we trying to just do things to him and impose consequences as a form of accountability, or are we trying to get him to take internal responsibility and therefore work towards changing his behaviour, without perhaps recognising that referring to him to a program is not in and of itself going to get him to change his behaviour. The other thing that we found was a really interesting divergence between the fact that there was certainly a system emerging, but there were gaps and disconnects in also, that's just one example that I've highlighted there, but a growing perception amongst perpetrators reported by practitioners, but I've also seen it across wider research that I do, that the system is against me, that there is a system in place and it's huge and it's a well-oiled machine which is out to get men. And that contributes to narratives of victimisation, which in turn gives in this case men, permission to game other parts of the system, to deploy the mechanisms of the family law system or the child protection system or whoever else against her, because why wouldn't I do that? Because when the system has been so unkind and unfair to me. So that's a real challenge for practitioners out there, where this narrative is building, this sort of becoming, it's very easy to Google men's rights movements. It'll tell you all the reasons why the system is against men, and to put that in your backpack of resentment and take it to any service with which or whom you're interacting. And that presents a real challenge, because it means that there are a range of other sort of objectives and that men may have when they're touching those different services that comprise either the broader perpetrator intervention system or the more conventional aspects of the perpetrator intervention system, which to this point, we've kind of expected to assume the responsibility to fix them. But where the examples of promising practice therefore come in are where services are working together to be alive to those examples of gaming the system, to be alive to the patterns of behaviour that might be threading through but not necessarily be apparent to an AOD service who's just training, dealing with someone who walks through the door. So the study did show multiple examples of really collaborative and really quite intelligent practice emerging, and that included the excellent example of child protection services in the region now involving or engaging perpetrator intervention and specialist women's services as part of their team who conducted outreach, who did interviews with families. Child protection workers in turn located at the local magistrates' courts, or efforts by local councils to really raise the awareness of their staff. But particular examples were the multidisciplinary centre, where specialist women's services, MBCP workers, child protection, corrections and specialist police investigation units are all co-located and working together towards the same end. And that was the real key. Co-location is itself not where the gold lies. It's about getting to understand what are our objectives. Why do you do this in this certain way? Oh, okay. Oh, right. I hadn't thought about that. All right. Well, we do it. Our expectations or our practice is this. How do we bring those together? Let's look at this case. Let's look at this family. How are we going to respond as a collaboration, not in silos? And so we heard about some fantastic examples that were already occurring in that context, where victim survivors may not have reached out for help had it not been for that collaborative practice, and perpetrators who had dropped out of view were able to be traced. But the other thing that we heard about, which I think goes back to that sense of identifying what is the purpose and function of our intervention, were emerging examples at what was at the time Victoria's first orange door, where MBCP workers were co-located there for some days and doing some of the outreach calls. And the information that they had been able to glean from the other practitioners working in their service informed the kind of conversation and the quality of the conversation that they were able to have with a man when they called him. It wasn't just about calling and engaging for engaging's sake. It was about the scrutiny that was able to be applied at the time. That meant that that engagement actually led somewhere, rather than, again, just reverting or defaulting to activity for activity's sake. So a few years on from the data collection, I think that understanding has really begun to emerge and be shared about the importance and value of those approaches, but it needs to be supported by investment in the mechanisms and the workforce, as I was saying before, that can really shape a genuine and effective perpetrator intervention system. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Helena. I think it's really useful to have the concrete example of the case study to distill some of those findings and emerging good practice. and to me it corroborated a lot of the work that came out of the partner contact research that Donna, you were also leading, and which Rodney, you were on. Rodney, just throwing it to you now in terms of commenting on the case studies and any of the findings.
Yes, I think drawing a few of these things together, and it always feels very big picture in talking about perpetrator intervention systems. I kind of like feel if I was a practitioner and trying to get my head around some of this stuff, because it's big. And I think when we're looking at a collective accountability, a collective response towards scaffolding systemic responses to perpetrators, then it is big. I think one of the things that various aspects of the research, the case studies, the mapping process, Karen, the conceptual work around accountability and responsibility, and the other aspects of this huge study all come together, is that it's really everybody's business in a way to try to scaffold a systemic response that will enable men to step into real, true accountability over time. And there are 20, 30 different workforces that have some touch points with perpetrators as they come into a different part of the system, whether it be initially justice or family-centred or AOD or mental health. And, one of the things that I think the multiple strands of the research really highlights is builds upon what you were saying earlier, Elena. How do we then map out what are appropriate roles and responsibilities and opportunities for very different workforces who have very different contexts of engaging with clients who might be causing family violence harm and have very different opportunities. Some workforces will be seeing men over a significant period of time. Others, it'll be one-off. And they've all got their core business to do. And so for each workforce to understand, what is my bit? Given my core business, how does not burying my head in the sand regarding this client's use of family and domestic violence, how's it important for me to do because it's related to my core business? And how, if I do bury my head in the sand, pretend that he's not a perpetrator, how that can actually interfere with my AOD work, or my mental health work, or my financial counselling work, why it's related to the core business. And then given my degree of specialisation, which might be zero, might be partial, given the context of the service, what's my role in not burying my head in the sand? And where are the limits of that role? And then how does my role then relate to other services that might be working with him now or over time? So there's a need, for mapping, firstly for charting out different roles, responsibilities, and parameters in engaging perpetrators. And some services and workforces will have roles that are mainly about detecting or identifying, as you're saying, Karen, somebody who's causing domestic and family violence harm. Maybe a bit of risk assessment, maybe a bit of information sharing. Others will have much more specialised roles. But mapping them out, helping different workforces and different subsystems within the system to work out, well, which of those roles and opportunities apply to us, which don't, and then how do I enact my role skillfully and safely in ways that integrates with all other services doing their bit across a period of time? And then what does that mean for workforce capability? What does that mean for supporting each individual workforce to have the understanding, the knowledge and the skills to safely apply their roles, their bit in working towards holding them accountable? How do we then have those communities of practice which embed those new practices? How do we support those workforces to be able to do so in ways that integrates with their core business? And then how do we create opportunities for information to be shared so that the system as a whole is able to develop a coherent story of who this man is, what's the harm that he's caused, what is his journey towards changing that harm, and what does that mean for accountability? How do we share that information across very different workforces to develop that overall map and story through which he can journey towards accountability? So lots of big picture challenges there that I think our research points to.
And you've made a very good start on that with the mapping project, which Karen, you led and is on the Curtin website. Donna, did you want to comment on any aspect of the case study? And then we'll go back to you, Rodney, because I know you've just actually started the answer for our last question in terms of next steps. But I'll throw to you, Donna, just very briefly before we do.
Rachel, could I get that final slide up, please? Thanks. I just wanted to sort of draw people's attention to part 3 of the report's got 3 new pieces of work which aren't necessarily directly about face-to-face work, but what we've done is a minimum data set, which is about what sort of data should be collected from in men's behaviour change programs to effectively do their work, and that's something that's been trialled with a number of practitioners, so it's not something that a bunch of researchers came up with as such. So I kind of wanted to point to that. There's a review, a meta-analysis of protection orders, and then finally I think what this points to is a new way of thinking about the costs of the economic cost of domestic and family violence. So what we've done is we've worked with an economist, Siobhan Austin, who's one of the authors, and what we do is a scenario setting approach, which is showing you not that what is the cost to everybody of domestic and family violence, but what happens if we don't intervene early. So the point is not does the intervention work, successful, unsuccessful, but actually what starts to happen when we don't intervene early, and the consequences not only personally but economically. So if you have a look at the slide there, what you can see we've done, or how we've modelled it, is that we've worked on a common situation with a family, and it's really just drawing your eye to the cost column there, where you can see that if there's a relatively early intervention, the cost of that is not necessarily effective, but it's $57,000 if we get involved early, whereas if there's no intervention, or the intervention is so poor that it enables the violence to keep escalating, we end up with a terrible tragedy, but also a $6.7 million cost. So you can see from 57,000 to 6.7 million, in terms of why systems have to work together, I think that whilst it's a case study, it really demonstrates to us why there's, not only safety, but incredible value in working together as multiple systems. But I know this work is not simple and it's not just easily achieved, so I think that's why it's good to look at next steps. So we hope the report's triggered a lot of will trigger conversations and considerations of next steps in much more strategic ways than we might have done in the past. Thanks.
Well, thanks, Donna. I think that's really useful in terms of, why does an integrated service model work? And in terms of both the social and economic costs, I think they're fairly well drawn out in that slide, which we'll put on the project page as well. Okay, so we're coming to the end, and we have some really good questions, so I do want to leave time for those. But just a short reflection from the panel, and I'll start with you, Rodney. And so it's a seminal piece of work. And has invited us to imagine a world in which all human service departments and agencies operated in a coordinated perpetrator intervention system to prevent and respond to violence, family violence. It is a long-term project, and Rodney, to start with you, you've outlined some of the workforce development issues in terms of next steps. What else do you see as critical next steps in implementing a coordinated response?
Yes, I think so many important aspects to this. I think the information sharing is really the information sharing about, firstly, how different workforces can be supported to record information about the harm that is caused, impacts, and then to be able to share that, to bring that together where it's needed. I know that different states, different jurisdictions have different information sharing legislations, but even with those that enable more information sharing, I don't think that's yet happening in a way where cross systems perpetrators are able to be followed to build that pattern. So for me, I think that's one of the major bodies of work, is how do we support when different services and agencies have different bits of information to be able to bring that together that actually maps the harm that he's causing. So, you know, I think that. And then I think the workforce development. How do we both bring different workforces together within local areas to work together about how to support accountability processes when the men will interact with different services, but also how do we support each separate workforce through working with their peak bodies to help them in navigating the skills and the motivations required for their practitioners to be engaging perpetrators according to particular mapped roles and responsibilities that are appropriate for them.
Great, thank you. And Elena, I might just throw to you. I mean, it carries on from your earlier comment about the objectives are really important, not necessarily the co-location. What do you see as the critical next step in implementing a truly coordinated and effective perpetrator intervention response or system?
Well, sometimes it feels a little bit overwhelming, doesn't it? Because we understand domestic and family violence to be occurring in epidemic proportions is something that it's often used to describe. But the fact of the matter is that I think some of the examples that we've looked at in this research and other emerging research demonstrates that it is achievable, and far from being an invisible epidemic which sweeps through our community without us being able to see it, or us being worried that we're going to be able to catch it by going to the supermarket and touching a shopping trolley, as we're all currently experiencing, particularly here in Victoria. What we're actually dealing with are identifiable individuals. We understand a lot more than we used to now about the causes. We understand about patterns. We can predict outcomes. So it is actually something that we can respond to if we make a decision that it's a priority. But what that involves is obviously significant policy investment and attention. And as we've seen in recent times, responses to family and domestic violence have become a political imperative and a policy imperative, and various major initiatives have flowed from that. And it's been such a hard-won victory trying to get the experience of victim survivors on the policy agenda after 30 years of people striving, you know, on the smell of an oily rag to get that acknowledged, that it's a difficult thing. People get anxious about then taking that next step to say, well, if we're actually going to really respond to risk, we also need to be investing in responses to perpetrators. We also need to all be understanding what that looks like. But in contrast to an epidemic or the pandemic we've actually experienced, what we've taken from that lesson is that we can respond to really significant social problems. We can make a decision to invest. We can look at what it looks like to provide social housing. We can look at what it looks like to provide proper health services. And we don't need contact tracing to do it. So all it needs really is a decision as a community and as policymakers to invest in that as a policy priority going forward.
Thanks, Elena. And Karen, what was your takeaway from the research? And then Donna, we'll finish up with you on the formal part of the panel discussion before we go to questions.
Okay, well, my comments are further comments about information sharing, really. But this time tilt towards the information that services and sectors share about themselves. Like a whole of system response to perpetration requires transparency concerning the actions being taken in relation to domestic and family violence. And information about individual perpetrators and the risks they pose is one thing, but also we need more general information relevant to perpetrator pathways, such as operational reviews, referral patterns, evaluations, and statistics about who accesses what services. This is information that would really contribute to the transparency needed to see what and where future efforts need to be directed. And one final comment is about information loops, which which are scarce at present and which really would help if they were developed. Like at the moment, as Elena earlier said, to the next service, and with that referral, we step back and absolve ourselves of any further responsibility instead of all staying connected and involved. So mechanisms for feeding information back to the referring agency would be really helpful. For instance, some courts can and often do refer perpetrators to men's behaviour change programs, but except for in a minor way with one or two jurisdictions, there is no mechanism by which the men's behaviour change program can feed back to the court information about the perpetrator's progress in that group or the level of risk that he still poses. So, so really looking at constructing workable information loops, I think, would be a very doable step forward.
And also critical in supporting the policy initiatives that Elena was just referring to as well. Yeah, thanks, Karen. And Donna, as the lead on this huge research project, what do you see as critical next steps to make this happen?
Oh, sorry, Michelle. I guess that, you know, to date, a lot of work about perpetrators has focused on men's behaviour change programs or particular judicial interventions around protection orders or pro-arrest policies, etc. And I guess if I think about this, because I always think in metaphors, like they're kind of, you know, 2 bedrooms within a house. And what we're kind of making a pitch for with this work is that, in fact, it's not even just one house, it's the whole street of houses that constitute the perpetrator intervention systems that we work with. So for me, it is about a kind, and that's in some ways what the maps do, is broaden out the whole thing to say, unless we're able to map patterns of behaviour, agencies co-share, and practitioners co-work around these issues, we're really not going to make any massive further progress into the future. That has workforce implications, it has agency policy implications, as Elena's alluded to, Karen, Rodney as well. And I guess that's why we've tried to put forward some things like a national minimum data set so that everybody across the country collects similar data, not only so that we can compare it over time and look how things are working, but so everybody's coming from the same, singing from the same hymn sheet, so as to speak, so that we do have a kind of shift, which is a sort of whole of the street and not individual bedrooms or individual houses making a shift. So I know it's a kind of a big ask around reform, but we really aren't going to see any change otherwise, I don't think, in any, you know, major way.
Thank you so much. Now we do, and you know, it's an incredible piece of work, and it does draw together so much of the importance and the evidence behind the need for a coordinated, integrated system across the prevention and response to domestic and family violence from both perpetrator and also victim survivor perspective. So to questions. So we have a few, so let's see how many we can get through. And you can start with this one, Donna. In a joined up unified system, what were your thoughts in making sure women's and children's voices, choices and agency don't get lost in collaborative service responses?
Yeah, I think that's a real risk, and I think even the term family violence can sometimes mean that everybody wants to reunify as a family. So I think we've got to be really clear that women's and children's safety, both at the time of reporting but also into the future, is actually our key focus. So I think accountability is important, but actually we've got to go back to safety. And I think one of the things with joined up services is we've got to navigate some really tricky ethical issues about how do we know as much as we can about risk from the women's and children's perspective, as well as what they want to do to feel safe, without in any way compromising their safety in the way that information is shared on a day-to-day basis. And that's why that workforce training around information sharing and the ethics of information sharing is absolutely critical. I also think that having substantive experts by experience type groups providing policy advice to obviously to sort of state and Commonwealth governments, but also to services in a kind of meaningful way, not in a tokenistic consumer response way, is a way that we have a powerful voice for women too, which is something, people are doing bits and pieces of, but I think something more substantive in that area, as well as a lot more opportunity for women's services to speak to how do they see these things working. So those who work with women need to be a key part of these future reforms in talking about how best to have perpetrator intervention systems, because we know, and some other work that Elena and Rodney and I are doing, we know that the bulk of the information about perpetrators and their risk comes from survivors, comes from those they've victimised, not from the men themselves. So, we've got to keep that at the front of our minds as well when we're doing this work.
Was there a comment from anyone else on the panel? We'll just keep going. And Rodney, this is to you. Is there any specific information available relating to the most effective ways for case managers to support the work done by MBCPs?
This is a newish area of practice because in general there has not really been funding for specialist case management work with men who are perpetrating family violence. But there is some initiatives that are happening more lately. So in New South Wales, in Victoria, for example, there has been some funding to enable specialist family violence oriented case management of men. It's something which the Magistrates Courts of Victoria as well too has started to look at through some work that we did together, Elena. So there is beginnings. Unfortunately, I think some of the practice learnings in these different projects are, as is often the case, siloed away at the moment, and I don't know how much publicly available. But there's some starting points of, maybe not an evidence base, but of some potential guidance for how specialists who are working with men on case managed needs, how they do that in ways that don't centralise his AOD, his mental health, etc., as the most important intervention targets, of how to still do men's family violence case management in ways that still has a strong risk management focus, risk assessment focus, accountability focus, while at the same time building his capacity to be able to participate in specialist interventions. Yeah.
And there's a bit of a segue to you, Elena. How do you see an organisation funded for different core business, example AOD, explaining to their funder that they need to do work on DFE?
Because it will improve the outcomes of their work as well as other people's, I think is the simple answer. I think gone are the days when people accept that working in silos and just purely for that one therapeutic or other service objective is enough. And I think funders are coming to understand that, but what we need to do is support people with frameworks that allow them to do that in a safe way and where they feel confident, because in saying that, this service might not be playing its part, or that's not the fault of the service or the individual practitioner, it's that they're not equipped with the framework of how to go about that, and therefore hold back, understandably, because we understand that intervention for intervention's sake is not okay, because interventions carry with them significant risk. We don't want to go off and send people or escalate risk in some way or send things in the wrong direction. So in terms of answering the question, I think it's all demand on human services is increased when people in the communities are vulnerable, and communities are made incredibly vulnerable And the cost to us as a community, as Donna demonstrated, is enormous if we don't start responding to domestic and family violence more appropriately and in a systemic way.
Thanks, Anna. And for the last question, Donna, this is a question related to the cost-benefit analysis. And the question is, thanks for attaching the cost-benefit analysis within the research. Are such innovations to the research the way forward in identifying realities of funding to develop accountability and a meaningful intervention system?
Yeah, I mean, I think that they do add, I mean, I think as a non-economist, that it's really important that you kind of have a socially minded, in my case, it was a feminist economist that I work with. But I do think what they can do is through the scenario setting, like the big national things where we count up how much things cost, it's great, it's important, but actually what that doesn't get down to the nitty gritty of families' lives and interventions. And I guess what this sort of work does, in my view, is bring together those issues. But importantly, as I pointed out, I think it doesn't get into this means a success or this means a failure. What it tells us is these range of services are going to be involved anyway. So the sooner you get them involved, the more likelihood is that you may prevent more severe violence, disability or death. And this is the benefits of doing that. So I think it really connects well and doesn't monetarize domestic violence in a vulgar way, but actually shows to us what most practitioners on the ground have been arguing for 50 years, you know. So I think, yeah, the more work like that we have, I think is strengthened, particularly because for everybody that works in government or works with government, we know how important the departments of finance and treasury are too, you know. So we need to kind of keep pace with that and keep our arguments up and strong.
Well, with that, I'd like to thank you all very much. Thank you to Karen and Donna in different parts of Western Australia, and being very innovative in the way that you were able to participate from the cafe. It was perfect background, Donna, and thanks, Karen. And thanks to Alana and to you, Rodney, in regional Victoria and in Melbourne. And the questions under which you've been able to participate today haven't been ideal, and we really thank you very much for being able to participate in that way, in the way that you have. And we didn't lose anybody, so that was great in terms of both audio and video. So the connectivity held up. So thank you to everybody who participated. The webinar will be recorded and available as soon as we can get it up. We will notify you through Notepad as to when it will be available. As you exit the webinar, there's a short feedback survey, and we greatly appreciate your feedback, as I mentioned earlier. It'll also, your feedback and responses will also help us improve the webinar program going forward. You can also, you can sign up to Notepad, and you can also access the research report, the research policy and practice, and the mapping website through the ANROWS website. Well, I think that's all for today. I'd like to thank you very much. I'm Michelle Robinson, and on behalf of ANROWS, say goodbye and keep well.